I think ego is important to people who are successful in anything, including the wrestling business. I think you need a certain element of ego to push you to be the best that you can be. But I think the ego can actually work against you at some point if you don't learn how to control it, contain it. And as much as I'm grateful to Dusty Rhodes and really regard him as a friend, it's not personal, but I think Dusty's ego has worked against him a lot, and it's really my only, I don't even like to call it criticism, observation. But I never had a huge ego. And maybe because of my humble beginnings to get into wrestling, that so many people helped me. I was so lucky in so many places that I never, and I wasn't the biggest guy. I wasn't the most talented guy. I just was very fortunate, and so I think that maybe that helped keep my ego or potential ego in check. But that was one of the few times where I showed my ass, and I like to think that there weren't many.
Well, in your defense, you were working the territory full time. You were being programmed with the top guys, Ricky Romero and
mainly Dick Murdoch. You look at Dick Murdoch, he was probably 285 and 6'4", just a big. Think of Stan Hansen, Dick Murdoch.
Well, this was kind of the same instance as the Clash of Champions in Corpus Christi, and you were there. When Milt Mascaras was brought in, because at that time, if you ran a Texas border town, it was thought you needed a Hispanic star to draw. And of course, Jim Barnett in the office, the only Hispanic star he knew was Milt Mascaras. It was about 20 years past his prime, so we brought him in to wrestle Cactus Jack. Mick Foley, who was like, "Oh my God, this 60-year-old man's going to beat me on national television," and we've talked about it. I kind of got in the corner with him. We came up with the idea. Take that bump you did in Memphis that I saw on the tape, and he took the Nestea plunge, and that's all people remember. It was the same situation. You were being programmed, you were a full-timer, and all of a sudden here comes this 60-year-old guy in, and he's going to be there one weekend.
He might have been well over 60.
Yeah, and JJ, do the job for him. So you didn't realize at the time the historical impact, and I don't think anybody did at the time, 30 years ago, that El Santo would have on the business, especially in Mexico, but around the world. So there was that reticence.
I would go to El Paso every week, and even back then, there was El Santo milk, and there would be a billboard with his kisser on the milk carton. And all the movies.
Would you buy your milk from a man who wears a mask, ladies and gentlemen?
And so he's coming in, and I remember, he was getting the VIP treatment, the funks. I think Dory was going to drive him around to the towns, and I remember one of the towns, and I said, Dory, I thought he was riding with you, and I'm looking around, and there's this little shrunken man sitting there wearing a hat, and I said, I thought Santo was riding with you. He said,
Ixnay on the Ento say.
What? So I don't know if that, now I'm thinking, hey, I stood toe-to-toe with Dick Murdoch, who, looked like he could have killed me, and I'm programmed with Ricky Romero, and I could see the logic because it was Romero and Santo, and I don't even remember who my partner was, but in my mind, okay, dropping falls at the end of it, but let me drop the fall to a guy that I have ongoing issues with. This guy's coming in, and it's like, I'm in my mind thinking, long term, not looking at what a special moment it was. And we drew a very, very good house, again, not because of me, the fact that El Santo was there and he had that kind of a following. And so, finally I got past showing my ass, and, this is what you need to do. Okay. And I remember his finish, he would get to the top turnbuckle and he would use the head dive into the pit of your stomach. And so Romero slammed me in position, and here he goes, and I remember it ringing my ears. He comes off that rope. Make sure he does not miss you. If you have to grab his head like a basketball and guide him, El Santo will not break his neck and die in one of our towns. Yeah. And so I remember that.
The biggest cultural icon of his generation is not going to get hurt in El Paso.
Yes. And so, again, years later, again, writing the book, caused me really to think back on so many special moments that I had, and really that was one of them. It was it was an honor to have been in the same ring with El Santo.
And then your first, you had made some trips to Florida in 71, 72, out of Charlotte, but your first stay there as a full-timer started out with actually one of the most famous incidents in wrestling history, much less Florida history, was Bobby Shane's plane crash.
Yeah.
Bobby Shane was, once again for the newer fans, was a tremendous athlete, tremendous worker, talker, colorful. Jerry Lawler got a lot of his
Shawn Michaels type.
A Shawn
character,
Michaels
to try and
type.
relate somebody who was brash, he was cocky,
Had a lady valet.
He was ahead of his time.
And Lawler got the king of wrestling, Bobby Shane. Jerry Lawler, I think, got his first crown from Bobby Shane when he was in Florida about this time, and it took a lot of his mannerisms.
Yeah.
And Lawler, a great worker, but Bobby Shane was an innovator. And you were there, 2 days, and their plane went down in Tampa Bay.
Shane was going to. What happened was when I went to Amarillo, I stayed a year. I went in right after the Maritimes in the month of November, and I was only there for 6 weeks till they closed down for Christmas for a couple weeks, and then I went to Japan for the first time, November of '74, and then stayed there the whole year, and then January of '75, and I was supposed to come back for some blow-off matches, but the Christmas week when we got ready to shut down, we had not a riot, mini riot. I wrestled Carl Cox in a cage, and after Carl beat me, Mulligan had just come in, and so he came down to the ring, came in, took a bottle of black ink, threw it in Cox's face, and we had some good heat. And on the way back, there's Blackjack Mulligan, and there's me, and I'm in front, and there was about an 18-year-old kid sitting in the top of the bleachers. We didn't know he was 18 at the time, but had the cowboy hat pulled down over his face, and here he came down out of the bleachers, went right past me, and threw a drop kick and hit Mulligan about the belt buckle. Down he went, Mulligan, he hit, pancaked over Mulligan. He no sooner had him the second time, and when he went down the second time, now there's blood out of both nostrils, out of both ears. Now, I don't know if he's got a knife or what, so the whole time he's going up and down, I'm kicking at him, never touched on, God is my witness, never touched him. But the ensuing thing was, we left that next day to go home wherever we lived for the holidays, and
and you get the phone call, don't come back,
don't come back,
sue.
lawsuit. This kid's father is hopping mad, nearly killed his son, the family's got money, and
you better go to Florida.
Yeah, big Mulligan, and you kicking him too. So the thing to Florida got.
That's how you got there.
So after the phone call, I go to Florida. Now, Bobby Shane had been in Australia and had a tremendous run up there, had I think booked there as well for Barnett, and so they somehow worked it out that it was time for Bobby to move on, and Eddie Graham was bringing him in to be the booker. And his first night in was Tampa on a Tuesday, and I want to say it might have been my first night in, or maybe I was in there one day before. But Tuesday night in Tampa, Bobby and I were tag partners, so I was in the match with him, no less. And then the next day we would do TV, and from TV we would go down to Miami, and it was the one long trip. It was like 250 miles, and doing TV, you were really under the gun to jump in your car and try to make it to Miami. And
a lot of the guys were flying private planes.
Yeah, most guys rode off, and Miami was a good town, so they would I'd rather fly and not beat my body up, and I'll eat some of the expense. So Buddy Colt was there at the time, and Buddy had bought his own plane. Had it about a month, 4-passenger plane. So he flew with Gary Hart, Dennis McCord, who was Austin Idol, and Bobby Shane, the four of them in the plane. And I went in another, a smaller plane, a 183 Cessna with a commercial pilot, and it was Murdoch, Bob Rupin, and me, and I went to Miami. And I remember being out at the airport. We were already in the plane, and looking out the window and seeing they were taxiing ahead of us, and I remember seeing Bobby's face out the window waving to us, and they took off ahead of us. And as is often happens in Florida, the weather changes rather abruptly, and a line of storms moved in between Miami and Tampa. And so as we're listening, we're saying, I'm here. We had heard that we had left from a private air center in Tampa International. They had closed down because of the weather and the low ceiling, Tampa International, but there was still Peter O. Knight Airport, which is a little Davis Island there. It has a little airport that was still open. So we were still cleared to get into there, and we figured, well, we'll figure some way to get over and get our cars. And, drinking and laughing, and as wrestlers do, and telling story. Now, the rain started really coming good, and as we're approaching Tampa, we heard the tower come on saying 456 BC. It was on final, but we never got confirmation of their landing. When you land, just verify their position. And I remember 456 BC because BC for Buddy Colt. And I knew that was called letters from his plane. So, hey, and all of a sudden, about a minute goes by, the transmission comes on. Forget 456 BC. We have confirmation that they're down in the bay with injuries. Well, we knew who it was, and of course we don't know the details, but you could have heard a pin drop at that point in our plane. And the pilot is, he's focused because the rain is teeming off the thing, and he's being given his coordinates, and altitudes, and we're just, and as we come into Peter O. Knight, we came down, and all of a sudden we went from being in total clouds, you can't see a thing, to breaking through the clouds, and it was like a clear night, just with a mist. And we were lined up perfectly, and we landed, and some people who listen to these CB radios that the emergency transmissions are on heard the plane was down, and so fans had come over in their cars to the island to see what it was. So they thought at first the plane had crashed. They didn't have the details, thought the plane had crashed at Peter O. Knight. When we came in, they recognized us. We'll give you a lift over, so to the other airport. And as we moved around, we looked down this street on the other side of the peninsula, and we could see the flashing lights of the ambulances. So we go down there, and I think Gary Hart had already been taken to the hospital, and Dennis McCord was laying in the ambulance, or vice versa. Dennis had gone and Gary was laying there. And they said one of them is still over here, so we go by these two houses, and you could see the wall to the bay, and it's choppy, and here was Buddy Colt laying on the ground in between the two houses, and his ankle was grotesquely turned the wrong ankle, and the paramedics were working on him, and Buddy was a big guy, and they didn't know how they were going to get him on a stretcher to lift him, so Murdoch and I said, we'll get him, and Dick got on one side, and I got on the other, and we got him onto a gurney, popped it up, and took him, and then there was a helicopter going all around the water with the searchlights looking for the wreckage and looking for Bobby Shane. He wasn't accounted for. So we ended the night not knowing Bobby's fate, and got to TV we had been to TV. The next day went to the office because I used to get paid on Thursdays. We went to the office, and they said that they found the wreckage, and divers had gone down, and Bobby was still strapped in the seat, and obviously was dead. And of course the stories then, that his fingers were locked under the seat belt, and and that he drowned and suffered this. And then I talked to the one diver, and he said no. He said he was knocked out on impact, and he said he simply drowned. That when they cut the seat belt to take him out, he said he just grabbed him by the front of the shirt, and he just floated out. But they said the wreckage looked like an engine went here and a wing went there, and it looked like the instrument panel, like the Incredible Hulk, had just gone in there and just ripped out wiring and instruments, and it must have been a terrible experience.
With the talent that he was, if he had lived another 5 years till Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS was really nationwide on the cable, and how big do you think Bobby Shane would have been?
Boy, I've often thought about that, and of course, we'll never know, so it's pure speculation, but you look at the guy's track record of success and where he'd been and what he'd done, and the other big factor is being there with Eddie Graham, because Eddie Graham had probably more of an influence on me than anyone else, and I'm not negating what the Sheik or Bruno or any of these other people did for me. But when I first was a kid and went to Madison Square, I went to Madison Square Garden to see Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie Graham. And so now I heard, what he had done in terms of, molding talent and what he had done for Jack Briscoe and building his career. And now I'm in Florida and I'm going to work for the guy that I saw in Madison Square Garden.
It's amazing the influence that Eddie Graham had. Bill Watson said the same thing. It was like going to wrestling college. I've talked to Kevin Sullivan, said the same thing. Dusty Rhodes learned most of what he knew in the early years from all those years in Florida with Eddie Graham. He was a genius.
Yeah, and he wasn't, I want to say he, had like a grade school education. He was a street smart guy, tough guy. He would brawl with the best of them, but the psychology aspect of our business is where he really excelled. And for him to do a finish was a long, drawn out thing, and you got to appreciate it because the more you were around him, you would understand the thought process that went into it.
He could see it in his head,
yes.
And when he relayed it to you, he could see how the fans were going to react to it, and he got the reaction he wanted because of the way.
And there was a logic to everything that he did too. There was, when you and I've had this conversation. In fact, we talked to a couple of the young Ring of Honor wrestlers who were asked about the role of the referee, the manager, and how all of that comes together in a match, and where Eddie was a master of, and it didn't necessarily have to involve a manager. Sometimes things happen in tag situations where the referee, didn't see something that happened, and you wanted the heat to go the right place, not on the referee. People don't buy tickets because they're mad at the referee, and Eddie was just a genius at laying everything out in a sequential, logical manner that got the results. And I never ever saw him fail. I never saw him, people go out and sometimes the execution is not perfect, but it just was so well thought through that he always got the right result.
The late 70s for you, you were all over the place. I want to hit some of these highlights. Once again, the book, shameless plug number 3, Wrestlers Are Like Seagulls. Now, I love this because I'm a detail person like you are, and I love the dates, the places, but you worked in the Dallas territory, you went to Georgia, Japan, back to Amarillo, managing Abdullah the Butcher, the Mongolian Stomper. But the highlight probably, I think, or maybe the low light you'd say of the late 70s for you was your time in Texas. In a 2-week period working for Paul Bosch in Houston, who was noted as one of the great payoff men. So Houston was really an important town in Texas, but at the same time, he was a little tough on you sometimes. You, in a 2-week period, you wrestled Victor the Bear, and you wrestled Paul Bosch when he was 65 in a bathtub match, which they were noted for in Houston, whether it be the loser has to wash a donkey in the ring, or we're going to clean that dirty wrestler up. So you got an opportunity to wrestle Paul Bosch in a bathtub match.
I never looked and researched it, but I would have to think it might have been the last time that Paul Bosch was ever in the ring. And his roots went back to I think the 30s. He was a warrior.
He was the guy who actually introduced Stu Hart to his wife Helen. So if not for Paul Bosch, there would be no Hart brothers.
Yes, they were all in New York at the time. But like you say, Paul was. When you went to Dallas, was the Dallas booking office that actually where the talent was centered, but it really was 3 separate operations, because Joe Blanchard had his own operation, which was basically San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and Austin, that didn't run every week. Paul had his own little thing, which was mainly just Houston on Friday nights, and then the rest was out of Dallas. So you could be figured in and do well in Dallas, but if you didn't do reasonably well in San Antonio, and if you didn't get your share of main events in Houston, that all had to come together. And I went in there with Stomper, and you get assurances that yes, you're going to get your opportunity, but you don't know till what happens. And then Archie, it was my first time managing. I'd never even contemplated managing, and I'd met Archie the first time in the Maritimes, wrestled in a 3-week program. And then when I went to Florida for that run, Archie was there and was around him again, and then he left to go to Tennessee with Bearcat Wright.
Bearcat Wright was his manager, and actually the incident which was not in your book, which you might not have known, was the reason why that Bearcat Wright left the Stomper and left managing Tennessee was in Louisville, Kentucky, when I was there and actually took pictures, which later on were subpoenaed. Bearcat Wright got such intense heat, but he was, I guess, a larger version of Sonny King. He was African American, about 6'7", 300 pounds, not a very good worker, but an inflammatory promo. And he got such heat at ringside. He's managing the Stomper one night. Stomper's just kicking the crap out of this guy in the ring, and this fan, who was about, if Bearcat Wright was 6'8", then his fan was 5'8", and about 190 pounds, but he was stocky and bald-headed too, so it was almost like comical. Walked up to Bearcat Wright and spun him around and threw a punch right into his stomach, and Bearcat Wright looked down at him and proceeded to kick the guy in the nuts, and when he went down, he stomped him about 8 times in his head, banging against the concrete floor, and I'm sitting on the front row with my little Kodak Instamatic going, this is better than what's going on in the ring. And they carried the guy out in convulsions on a stretcher, and that was the last time Bearcat Wright appeared in the Tennessee territory.
I never did hear that story.
I witnessed it. Wow. And so Stomper was doing his own promos, and he was not a wrestler that should talk, so that's where you came in.
Yeah, it wasn't consistent with his image.
So you're managing the Stomper in Texas, and of course Paul Bosch everybody's got to get in on the act. And Paul Bosch has to clean up that dirty manager, J.J. Dillon.
It was the end of my run. I went to and enjoyed some success with Archie and really cut my teeth on being a manager and what it was all about, and enjoyed some success there. And that was really a turning point again for my career to go into to something that I'm actually best remembered for, that probably never would have happened if it hadn't been a phone call from Archie because of what happened with him in Bearcat, Tennessee. I mean, it's so, it's like, I got to get out of here. I'm dead. I started doing my own promos, and the people were just killed my character. And so he said, I got a chance to go to Dallas, so that's how we hooked up. Well, Archie, he would get paranoid. He would say, after a little while, we'll just take one little thing, and it's like, they got no plans for us. And Archie he would pack his belongings in the middle of the night.
And just go.
And he always would go back to Calgary knowing that Stu would be delighted to see him and have him back there, knowing he was going to draw some money with the guy. And he was always comfortable being back in that environment. Well, when this happened, it was totally unexpected. Thankfully, the office said, well, you're a lot of the heat goes with you because you guys of your association, so we want you to stay. We'll put you with somebody else, and hopefully that'll help elevate whoever it is because you're managing. So that made sense to me, and I think I had Toru Tanaka for a while, and that's when I first met Sakurada and Mr. Hito. But anyway, they eventually brought in Moondog Mayne, and he was again one of the characters of the business, and had a great time with Lonnie. And at the end of that run, when it was time for me to go, because Archie, I knew with Lonnie that it was a short-term thing, and meanwhile Archie had called me back and told me, what a huge mistake I made. We had a good thing going, a great chemistry, and I got feelers out with Vern Gagne and with Barnett in Atlanta, and both of them were interested in this, and ended up had a starting date. Actually got a start date in Atlanta with Barnett, and the next day Vern called and to offer a starting date, and he was upset because we were good to our word and went to Atlanta. But I knew I was finishing up. So the last 2 weeks in Houston, like you say, Paul's going to get his pound of flesh, and so the next to last week was, backing up before that, I had a match, and Gary Hart, I always respect Gary Hart because he was a great heel. And when I came in, because I was fresh, not because I'm more talented or can get heat better than Gary Hart, but Gary had been there for a long time. So it was easier for him to endear himself.
He may be a prick, but he's our prick.
Yes. And so he was managing Lothario in Houston for these series of matches because they had been adversaries, and because I was with Moondog. So the story was that Lothario wrestled Moondog Mayne with Gary in his corner, me in Moondog's corner, and if Moondog lost, I had to eat the can of dog food. So that was the first one. And there's a picture in my book with me sitting in the middle of the ring with a horrible look on my face and just food poured everywhere. where, of course, I had to eat the can of dog food. Now, Paul Bosch is going to get his pound of flesh. So it was the bathtub match, which I'd never seen, and they'd bring this big aluminum tub in the ring where you could wash 3 or 4 babies in it. Brought in the buckets of water, fill it up, and now the only way the match ends is whoever goes into the bathtub first. And it's a silly match to work with. And I remember Paul, lock fingers, go down in the water, and then all of a sudden he, and then he took my shoe off and sunk it in the water, and as I go to get the shoe, he beats me to it, whacks me in the head with my own shoe with water flying everywhere. And I probably got a little heat on him, I don't remember. It couldn't have been much, but anyway, now Moondog is down at ringside. I remember the end of the match was, I get a little heat on him, but I need to put him away, and so Moondog comes up on the apron. I hook Paul, and I'm taking him over to Moondog, and Moondog comes with a big chop. Of course, Paul ducks, and Moondog chops me, and it's one of these. And there's a thing behind me, and Paul just, this one, of course, my ass hits the water, and water flew everywhere, and I'm soaked.
And out there, nobody can stumble, fumble, and fall better than you. Everything is moving. You look like the private detective getting murdered in Psycho, going backwards down the stairs when you would take one of those bumps like.
And then, of course, to add insult to injury, my final appearance in Houston was I had to wrestle. I was so mad at Paul Bosch. Now I signed an open contract to take on anybody. I had to restore my credibility. Okay, we'll take that open contract and write in here Victor the Bear. And so my last week, I of course wrestled the Bear, and then it was sayonara, and I went off to Dallas.
You, like I said, the late 70s, Georgia, Japan, Amarillo, Australia, Calgary, a brief time for Stu Hart, but an important turning point, I think, was 1981. You went to Kansas City. That was your first booking position, and you were the...
Actually, I had booked in Australia the year before, and that it was... I always had, even back to when I went to Florida the first time in '85, when Bobby Shane went down, they brought Harley Race in, and Harley did a great job booking. I really respect Harley for what he accomplished.
You had worked around Eddie, and you'd worked around Harley, and you got a chance to offer input as a top manager.
Well, what happened on Friday night, there were 2 towns that weren't major towns. You either went to Tallahassee or you went to Fort Lauderdale. And Mike Graham kind of had his little deal going down in Fort Lauderdale at the National Guard Army, so he was there every week, and I was in Jacksonville just about every Friday, or not, in Tallahassee every Friday night. Well, it got to the point I would handle the show. So it was kind of my first step in. I worked with the Funks, and when they had their booking meetings, sat in and gave ideas and suggestions. Now it's like Friday nights, and Eddie's calling me, and I'm talking to Eddie Graham, going over the card with what he wants that night, because you give Harley a little break that night. And
I gotta wonder though, after all these influences, and you learn from all these different people, and you get the opportunity finally in the United States, your first booking position, you're the booker in Kansas City, which was probably at that time the territory you either went to when you had nowhere else to go at the beginning of your career, or the couple guys were winding down their career. Talent was short, buildings were not big, fans were not plentiful. You had to think, my God, when you got there, what am I going to do?
I was very lucky through my career that some guys hit a point where like nothing's happening for them, and I always, when one door closed behind me, another one opened in front of me, and it was only after I'd gone to Germany in 1980, and I had that trip to Japan, and I didn't have no bookings on the other side. Amarillo, after Mario Savoldi came in there to try and help Mulligan and Murdoch, and that thing was...
The Funks had sold to Mickey Murdoch and Blackjack Mulligan, and it wasn't working. And
so I got out of there and got booked in... Les Thornton got me booked in Germany, which I'd always wanted to go to for that experience. Had a Japan trip, and then you mentioned earlier Calgary. The fan of me, I never ever lost, and I heard all the stories about the Dungeon, Stu Hart, Ed Whalen, and the Stampede Wrestling, and I wanted experience. I went through the same thing. I always wanted to work for Don and Elton Owen, which I did the same thing, got booked out there for a week during my career. But on the way back from Japan, because Hito lived in Calgary and Sakurada was going back there, so I was able to come in for a week, and I worked that territory for a week, and I was at the house and around Stu, and those are treasured memories for me, looking back with the history of the business. But I didn't have a place to go, and that was kind of a scary thing for me. And I talked to Eddie Graham before I left, and he said, "Let me see what I can do. Let me make some calls." So I went to Germany, came back, and that's when I called Eddie. And I was going to Japan, and he said, "Call me when you get back from Japan." That's another rib. When I got to Calgary, I didn't have a place to go, and I didn't. I thought, well, I don't want to bug Eddie and call him 10 times a day. But I've got a week's booking, and then I don't have anything. What am I going to do? And that week, I made some trips. We went down to Montana. Jim Neidhart was there, and Neidhart would drive the van. Well, when we would stop on a long trip for a rest stop, I would get to a phone, and this is before cell phones and all that, where I would get to a phone, and I talked to Eddie, and he'd say, "Well, give me a call back this afternoon. I'm trying to work something out for you," because he said, "I don't have anything in Florida." He said, I want you to come here someday when it is right, but meanwhile, let me try to help you." So every time we stopped, and sometimes I would call and miss him. Well, the other guys, and they didn't know why I was getting off.
So you had a bladder control problem or something?
No, they saw me going to the phone. And Neidhart, he had his little quirks and his little habits, and the other guys were telling Neidhart, I said, "Hey, every time you get off here, he's going to the phone and calling Stu." So the boys were stirring it up with Neidhart that I was stooging the Stu on everything that he did. So Neidhart is a nervous individual anyway, and so the guys were having a little fun. And I'm not sure if it was at his expense, at my expense, or the combination of both. But anyway, I was calling Eddie every chance that I could get to him. And then finally, I called and he said, "I talked to somebody who's an old friend," and he said, "They desperately need help." And he said, "I personally recommended you that if anybody can help them, you can." And that's when he said, "I want you to call Bob Geigel." And I knew kind of what I was stepping into, but the other side of it was I was so thankful that with what Eddie had done to open the door for me, because I didn't have any place to work. And called Bible and Bob, and he said, I'd never met him. And he said, Eddie called, and he said, his word's good enough for me. I've heard about you, and that's when I went in there.
And you had such tremendous talent to work with, like Bulldog Bob Brown and
Rufus R. Jones,
Rufus R. Freight Train Jones,
and Bruiser Bob Sweetan, and Terry Taylor was there. I mean, and Buzz Avalanche Tyler. There was, but it just.
Were you the actual booker of the territory September 17th, 1981, when Dusty won the title from Flair? I
was there that night in Kansas City, and of course we didn't tell us till the last minute, but when we saw Dusty come in, and we see the wives come in, something's up, and that was kind of a similar operation where Sam Muchnick had St. Louis, which was. They used the Kansas City talent, but Sam brought his own people, and so you hope that you got your positions on the card, and that's where I wrestled Dick the Bruiser, who's another one of the legends in the business, was in St. Louis.
But you obviously you got your feet wet booking, and you'd made an impression
in Australia. I left that out. I went to Australia with the idea that I was coming into I went in there to replace Bruiser Brody with. Brute Bernard, because they were desperate for talent. And it was at a time when business was good in the States. So nobody wanted to go halfway around the world to Australia for, in most cases, no more money than what you could make if you found a good spot here. And Ron Miller and Larry O'Day, they weren't Jim Barnett. Times had changed. They didn't want to risk the money, and so they didn't want to spend money for talent.
The glory days of Australian wrestling had been 10 years beforehand.
And it was at a time too where there was scrutiny in the television industry about violence on television, and so I remember Waldo von Erich was there, and at the Channel 9 studios, he went under the ring in the corner, and they would put sandbags on the corner post so the ring wouldn't shift. He took the sandbag and hit a guy, and they almost stopped the show right in the middle of the taping session. So you could
Waldo
virtually
was
do
noted for getting wrestling television pulled in various parts of the world.
But again, everything was a learning experience for me, and as you, I'm sure, can relate to. I'm not saying that anybody can take a situation where you have a great talent roster, great depth in the talent roster, and be successful. The real challenge is to go somewhere, where you say where you're making chicken salad out of chicken feathers. That's the real challenge, and it can be. I think I had the temperament for it because I'm very laid back. I'm not volatile, and so I had the patience that maybe others wouldn't have, and probably stuck it out longer for those same reasons. But the other big thing was, it was right when cable television was coming into the impact that it had on the business, and the TV show was taped by the sister station in Kansas City with their mobile truck, and they would then, which had always been the formula, bicycle the tape around the different territories, which would take 4 or 5 weeks. But what happened, cable television was now a reality, and that same UHF station was on the cable networks, because the cable networks each had their own affiliate of the major networks. So the UHF stations were different programming, right, and that's why they had the appeal to be on the cable networks.
And as a result, if you tape a television show in Kansas City and it might not air in Topeka or over in Des Moines or whatever for 4 weeks. On the bicycle, the people in Des Moines would see the Kansas City station, they'd see it 4 weeks ahead to screw up your whole timing, all your plans.
It basically, that was the problem, that you could no longer protect the bicycle, and even though your promos were on the network bicycle version for the town, you couldn't do it off the Kansas City show because you were driving hard for Kansas City. But when you worked a 3-week program, the people were knowing what the blow-off was in the 3rd week, because all they had to do was watch the Kansas City TV. And it became clear to me, because when you have that blank sheet of paper and got to do the booking, it becomes real clear real fast. And Bob Geigel, and this is not a knock on Bob, a tremendous human being, but it's like, he thought we just need to do something different, or we need more heat, or we need, it wasn't that. It was the lay of the land that was killing us.
The concept of television may have still been a little new to Bob Geigel, but they still had, tape was on 2 inches in these great big huge boxes, and I remember to this day he had a shopping cart in the office that they would bring, the 2-inch tapes would come back, they would erase them, re-record over them, the dubs, dump the promos in for the town, and he would take them to the bus station for Greyhound to put them on a bus
back to the town. And
state-of-the-art television distribution.
Done that for so long that it was a way of life to him, and I guess he didn't want to see that the people in each of these towns were watching at the same time the core Kansas City television that was given away.
And also seeing Superstation TBS, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and all the top stars.
Which impacted the whole country.
As a matter of fact, it was great. In 1982, really, when you went back to Florida to have a booking position there, that's what really started probably your most famous run, which would continue in the Carolinas, but you were working closely with Dusty. When Dusty came in, you were working closely with him, as you did for Jim Crockett in the Carolinas. And also, this was where I first saw you in person, because you did a deal which was kind of unique at the time. You were a heel manager in Florida, and you had your stable there, but you made an arrangement with Jarrett in the Memphis territory. They debuted Kamala, the Ugandan Giant, which the videotape of Kamala in Africa was done in Africa was Jarrett's backyard in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He came out of the bushes, but since Jimmy Hart had everybody and they wanted to do something different, you were his manager. You would sit him in, even though you weren't appearing in the territory, you'd do the promos on television. And I remember they got Kamala over so strong, he beat everybody in the territory. He beat Lawler first, which was different from the way they usually did it. Beat Lawler first, then went through every babyface, and then finally got Lawler again. This time you would come in from Florida, and you were such a strong personality, a new personality at the time,
That was new, I think, is where they were.
You turned Jimmy Hart babyface because now Jimmy Hart, the heel manager in Memphis, is like,
he's our asshole.
He's our prick. And who's this guy coming in from Florida that's going to take over in this Kamala the Ugandan Giant? And baby, I tell you what, baby, you know, and it was great television, and I loved seeing that. That was about 2 or 3 months before I got in the business, and I'm still at ringside taking pictures, and I'm going, this is great stuff.
But this sounds like an echo again, but so many things happen by accident, and that was one of those things too, that the territory had been down, and Lawler always knew how to promote himself and used to book himself out to other territories so that he had national exposure, and that helped keep his the way he was perceived back in the Tennessee territory. Well, he was brought down to St. Pete for a Bayfront Center, which was kind of like the big show once a month. They moved from Tampa over there. And he was wrestling Kendo Nagasaki, who I managed, and Jerry said to Eddie, can we take the match? Lawler was a Southern champion, and he said, have Kendo beat me, and then maybe it'll give us a little boost in business if he can come up there as the champion, and I'm trying to get it back, chasing my title. And of course, you know, Eddie was a good businessman and said, fine. Well, I remember Lawler saying to me, he said, you know, our business is down, and he said, you're his manager, but you know, they don't know that. I can't really afford to bring in. He said, would you do me a favor and do a promo? I said, absolutely, sure, happy to do it. And so I recorded a promo for the Memphis return for Kendo and Lawler. Didn't think anything more of it. Kendo goes up there by himself. I get a phone call again, and it's Lawler again. He said, God, he said, our house jumped unbelievable, and he said, we hated to blow it off because it jumped so much, so we've worked a return. He said, can I ask you a favor? He said, would you mind doing one more promo? And Eddie said, we'll be fine, just do it there and ship it up, and we'll air it up here. Sure, no problem. So again, I did the promo the second time. Well, the second time, he said, we figured a way to get a third one out of it. And so he said, would you do one more favor? Yeah. Do one more promo? And so, you know, I said I was coming up there. And so now they did huge business for those 3 weeks. And now they had to blow it off. And the story I got was that Jarrett and Lawler were talking. They said, well, why this Kendo Nagasaki with his makeup and all that is a bizarre figure? Why can't we create a Kendo Nagasaki? And I guess Big Jim Harris had the story was had just come back from England.
Sugar Bear
was kind of down on his luck, and he'd come back to try and sell a couple extra pair of trunks that he had to just put some money in his pocket. And he walked in the dressing room, and somebody looked at him and said, well, you know, why don't we create this Potbelly Witch Doctor? And they looked at him and got some paint. So I get the phone call now, and they said, tell me the story. And they said, we have this guy, and of course, as they're telling me over the phone, he was close to 7 foot tall and this big giant. And they said, can you do a promo for him? And I said, yeah. And I said, I've never seen him. Don't want to. And of course, they're giving me all this information on the phone. So I concocted a story that I was going to be there for when the title changed back to Lawler, and that they had called in, which you couldn't say that now. Somebody called in a bomb scare, and they diverted my plane, and I know they were behind it, and my limo raced up to the front of the Mid-South Coliseum, and as I went running in to see if people rushed out, I could hear them yelling and screaming, and they near trampled me, and you know, I talked about how I was so embarrassed and humiliated, and it was all their fault, and that I've had this guy under wraps, and that he was not humanized in the ways of civilized man, and I in good conscience couldn't release him on the wrestling world, but they've
forced your hand.
They have forced my hand, and I don't care, to be honest with you. They find out they're messing with the wrong guy, and so now that's how that started.
And the video they did, Michael St. John, the announcer in Nashville, is doing the voiceover. Kamala's coming out of the Ugandan jungle. He's coming out of the brush in back of Jerry's place, and he hadn't cleared yet. And the voiceover is, Kamala, 6'10". Kamala, 350 pounds. Kamala, wilder than the wildest beast of the jungle. Kamala, the Ugandan giant, is coming soon. And he's going, and it worked. It worked.
So, and again, this went on. And so finally, Jarrett calls one day, and he said, I said, I got people stopping me and saying, well, and again, it was the supply and demand thing, kind of the same effect of cable television, that here they're seeing me on their TV every week, but I am unique because I'm not in their town every week.
Exactly.
And now they're asking, well, when are we going to see him? And I became kind of a cult personality of doing all these interviews, but never physically being there. And so they asked me if I could come up and do one day or so I said, well, I work for Eddie, And so they called Eddie, and Eddie said, yeah, we can let you go for Monday, And so I went up, and I ended up a run of several months where I would come up just doing Mondays, and then it was like, well, could you come up the week we run this and
Monday,
this?
Tuesday, Louisville, Wednesday, Evansville, Thursday, Lexington. As a matter of fact, and you had a couple of single matches against Lawler, and like I said, I obviously knew who you were, primarily as a manager, because you'd been doing that primarily from the late 70s, and you hadn't, cable at the time was not that widespread, VCR, blah, blah, blah. So when I said, they're going to have JJ wrestle Lawler in the main event, this is probably, he's a manager, because I'm attuned to managers, not, you all had a great match. You really did, especially the one in Rep Arena, I remember especially, but and that's also, he got Hart involved so that they would have something to branch off of when you went back to Florida. Jimmy Hart said, I'll manage you, King. We got to turn back this invader, J.J. Dillon, together. And then, of course, as soon as they do that, then immediately Hart sticks it to Lawler, and then they're off and running again.
But I had learned a valuable lesson about, and we talked about egos before, and that there were only a couple times that I really think my ego clouded my better judgment. And to digress back, when I was in Dallas and territory, working in Houston, managing the Stomper, they finally went into a double main event because Paul always liked Gino Hernandez, and it was Lothario against Stomper, and I was in the next match against Gino Hernandez. I always took a tremendous amount of pride in how I had grown as a wrestler, and always wanted to be perceived as being a quality worker. So I went out in Houston with Gino Hernandez, the high spots, everything, click, 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 and thought that I had this great match. Came back to the dressing room, and there's Paul Bosch. Yeah, this look on his face.
Well, you've killed my town.
That was horrible. And at the time, I didn't understand, but he was absolutely right, because where I had failed is that there was a certain perception, which is kind of where you were going with me coming in, being known as a manager, and I'm going to wrestle Lawler, that what I did was I went out and wrestled like a wrestler, because I wasn't thinking of the business, I wasn't thinking of the people, I was thinking of the other boys in the dressing room, and
show them what you could do.
Show them what I could do, because I'd been a manager, and maybe they forgot that I was a quality worker, and that's what I went out to prove, and I was absolutely wrong.
And that's what a lot of guys make the mistake today, is they want to, it's like nuclear disarmament. If you don't agree to keep the same level playing field, then if everybody doesn't agree, nobody can. If a manager can be competitive with a top wrestler, then it doesn't look right. So a lot of times, guys don't do what's right for business because they want to show all of their talent that particular day instead of working the match that they should work with that opponent.
There is an art to wrestling like a manager, and that's what I lost. I lost it that night, and I was wrong. And Paul let me know, and I didn't understand at the moment, the same as I didn't understand why I should drop a fall to El Santo. It was one of those other things where I let my ego get the better of me, and Paul Bosch was absolutely right, and I was wrong. And I learned a very valuable lesson there, that I never got myself caught up in that same situation again. That it was a little bit different when I went in, because I hadn't been a manager that long. They hadn't seen me, and so I could get by with a little bit. But I often learn out of that.
You spent a couple of years in Florida. Dusty was booking. You were the detail man, as you would be later on. Dusty went to Charlotte, and he had the concept for Starrcade. The first Starrcade was in '83, while he was still booking in Florida for Eddie. But then Crockett's business after that initial Starrcade was down, and he brought Dusty up, and Dusty brought you, I believe, in '84 to be his assistant, because Dusty was a great idea guy, but I mean, he buy the plane and figure out where to fly, but he'd forget to put gas in it.
He'd write down the TV, and he'd throw that Louis Vuitton bag over his shoulder, throw the paper down.
His TV format was everybody's initials, JC versus JJ.
He'd have the same guy down twice.
Yeah. Business was down, but it popped as he started bringing in different talent into Carolinas, and finally, in the fall of '85, after about a year in, things were starting to cook, and then came, once again by accident, as all great concepts are, the birth of the Four Horsemen.
Yeah, I want to back up for just a second because, again, everything is a learning experience, and I always want to balance that. I've made statements about Dusty and his ego, and some of it's been twisted around to think that I have an axe to grind with Dusty, or there is something personal, and trust me, there isn't. I don't know how Dusty feels. I don't know that Dusty is all that receptive to any kind of criticism because of the ego thing. But when I wrote the book,
it's part of being Dusty.
When I wrote the book, I decided that I was going to do it right or not do it at all, and I wanted to be open and honest, and I wanted to take a hard look at anybody and everybody that and again, it's one man's opinion. It's not saying that I'm right or wrong, but I was willing to express that opinion, and at the same time wanted to be able to look in the mirror and talk about the El Santo situation and the Paul Bosch situations where I had not used the best judgment. I've made mistakes, a lot of mistakes along the way, and you have to be open about where your strengths are. And as we go much later on, I recognize the fact that an Erich Bischoff can walk into a room with TBS executives and have a much greater impact with no knowledge of the wrestling business than with my wealth of knowledge, because it's not my personality. I don't walk into a room and light it up. So they look at the two people and they're going to gravitate to him. He gets the opportunity and kills the business where I could have helped him. But when I finished up in Florida, I got a call from the one promoter in the Maritimes, and there was a guy that had the contacts to get the Halifax Forum and the TV up there, a guy named Al Zink, who was in conflict with the case. They didn't like each other, and ended up, their business had been closed down, and now they wanted to start it up again. And they called me and offered me an opportunity to come in and be a partner, and no financial investment. And again, I have to credit Eddie Graham. Eddie Graham let me go through his entire video library, take cuts of people like Bob Delasera, who was accessible, that had wrestled in Florida, and I took all this bag of tapes up there and did 6 weeks of TV shows sitting on a lounge chair and introducing ins and outs of people that I could get to come in to open up the territory. Eddie didn't charge me a dime for that. And Dusty did it with his blessing, and I left there, and they gave me a check for an extra $500 or something, and I went up there thinking that was my other dream. Now I want to be a promoter.
Yeah.
You go down that road.
Ixnay on the promoter day.
I learned a very valuable lesson and I use the analogy. It's like a bar stool with four legs, and wrestling is the same way. You have to have good talent. You then have to have storylines to do something with those talent. You have to have a management to control the talent, and then you have to have a television outlet to showcase the talent and the storylines that you create. If you take any one of those things out of the equation, that thing's going to fall over and you're going to fall on your ass. You can have the greatest TV time in the world, but if you don't have the talent and know what to do with it, you're going to fail. If you have the talent, know what to do with it, and don't have the television outlet, nobody's going to see it, which is what happened up there. They had a promise of getting on TV, and they ended up, it was the infancy of satellite television up there, and they put them on a sister satellite network that had about 20% viewership of the other. And it failed, and of course, it wasn't until after the fact that I knew. When I knew it was failing and I had to get out, I didn't know where to go, called Dusty back, and I said, Dusty, I got to get out of here. And he said, I just cut a deal with Jim Crockett. I'm going in there starting next week. And he said, pack your bags and just come direct to Charlotte. I said, well, do I have to call Jim Crockett? Nope. We'll pick it up where we left it off. And that's how I ended up coming there. And he said, I'll take care of your deal, we'll work something out. And so I just got in the car and came to Charlotte. Right at the beginning, again, the timing of when I got there, and in the beginning of, it was Ron Bass and Black Bart, and which is not a knock on them, but everything was a growing evolution before we got to, of course, the tremendous success of the Horsemen, which is probably what I'm best remembered.
And of course, the Horsemen was not something that was planned. You were managing Tully.
Yeah.
Tully and Arn would have some tag matches. Ole and Arn were primarily the team at that time, and Flair, of course, was the champ, the Nate.
Yeah.
But they gravitated together because they were the top heel group, and you sort of became their de facto manager in certain circumstances. And then finally, I believe it was Arn one day that said, "Had this much havoc hasn't been caused since the days of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse."
That's how it was.
And this, and that's what started it.
Yeah,
And
it wasn't. We, as you know,
much like Pete Best was the fifth Beatle, you were the fifth Horseman.
Yeah. We used to go to TV and record it on Saturday mornings, and we'd be up late Friday, depending on where we were, and most time had to get on a plane to go somewhere Saturday night. And some of the best television, as I look back, was nights when we didn't get the sleep we should have, and we
did some things you shouldn't have.
we ran hard. We ran hard in those, and it's the lifestyle of really of the wrestling business as I knew it when it was most successful. It was not something for everybody because it was hard work.
Well, the schedule at that time, and I mean, it was the height of ridiculousness to do a Sunday where you had Greensboro, North Carolina at 2 in the afternoon and Albuquerque, New Mexico at 7:30 that night.
Yep.
And somehow we bridged the time zones and the private jet and made it. But at that time it was 7 days a week, maybe 1 or 2 days a month off.
Yep.
Double shots and triple shots every Saturday when you counted 2 tapes in the morning of television on TBS and then a show that night.
But for me, I was thankful to be in the group that was enjoying that success. I wasn't thinking about how many days I did or didn't have off. It just one day moved to the next, and you never looked at the calendar, the day of the week, and it just kept going. But when we would get to the TV,
you were doing double duty. You were
I was
talent
doing
and
double duty,
office.
and on that day, I think it was one of those things where matches would go short and things would happen that you'd have to adapt to. And it's like you said, Flair was the world champion, and Tully was I think national TV champion, and I was only managing him. Ole and Arn were the tag champions, so they had all the belts. So I think somebody said, "Well, you all the champions, just go." And we all went out there, and there was no message. We weren't out there to promote something specifically, and the thing just went around. And I don't want to say we were filling time, but
Well, at that time, when you went out on television, rather than doing some overly pre-produced, scripted promo about this long, drawn-out angle, it was simply, we're going to get ourselves over. We're going to talk about ourselves. We're going to tell the fans why they should want to pay to see us and want to pay to see us whip whoever or get whipped, vice versa. And it was more of the personalities came out because it was left up to the individual. Dusty would say, "Okay, you got 3 minutes, Cornette. Tell me why I want to see the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express." Or JJ,
that's why I can never understand the scripted things, because you were different than I was. We each had our own personality, and what we did on camera was an extension of that personality and that persona. For somebody to hand you a script, you're not Jim Cornette anymore.
15 people sound the same.
Yes.
And we've talked about this so much, is that sameness takes away the individuality of the talent, which is what primarily sells the tickets. You have a conflict between 2 people that are over, one that the fans probably like and one that they don't like, and who's going to win, and let them sell it. The art of booking is putting those colorful personalities together in that particular instance, instead of telling them how to put one foot in front of the other.
And you were always blessed with great talent to be a storyteller and to tell stories, and all you needed to know was where you were and where you were trying to get to, and then you ran from there. Nobody had to tell you what to say. In the second you heard, you sleep.
Well, and that's the thing is, I absorbed what I could relate to about professional wrestling, and then through, was from being a fan, and then threw my own thing in there. And whereas I was a young, pampered smartass, you were a pompous, arrogant, overbearing type of full of hot air,
But in a different kind of
but
way.
in a totally different way. So everything, you had your Cowboys, your Indians, Dr.
Yeah.
Floggers, etc. With Tully and Arn and Ole was kind of the square peg on that
Yeah.
team, even though he fit in with the wrestling, he didn't fit with the personalities. But what really had to be a strange fit was Ole. I think goes away. I think that's one of the times he retired, which everybody was probably looking forward to. Sorry, Ole, no, I'm kidding. Here comes Lex Luger, the $350,000 baby from Florida.
Yeah.
Had been given big contracts because of his look from the day he started in Florida. Comes into the first guaranteed contract in Crockett Promotions, making a lot more money than most of the guys.
Plus, the story had gotten out about the circumstances in Florida, climbing out of a cage match with Bruiser Brody, and so there was already a big question mark over, what's this guy made of?
How did I know how the fans took Luger, but how did Arn and Tully and Flair and yourself, how did Lex begin to fit in there?
Well, I think we were told that he was available, and so we were going to get him, and and again, it was like the best fit to immediately put him on the fast track, not knowing what he could or couldn't do, whether he would be partly protected by being part of this group or what, until we saw what we had.
As sort of on the job experience,
Yeah.
also working alongside Flair and Tully and Arn in that respect, so protected and groomed.
It moved Ole, like you say, the square peg in the round circle out of the equation, and it also gave us the advantage of creating a fresh opponent, because we blamed Ole for losing the titles, and Ole always could talk, and so we accomplished a couple of things.
Tremendous credible promo,
Yes,
and that's
absolutely.
what really carried a lot of his issues. And then after Luger, the next Horseman
Was Barry Windham.
a much better fit in terms of personality and what a worker. At the time, there was probably no babyface better. I mean, the Flair and Windham matches for the NWA title were legendary. There was no better babyface, but as a heel, he had a whole nother dimension, and his work was impeccable at that time. The top 5 in the business.
I'm always asked about who was my favorite or which was the best, and I'm sure with you with the Midnight Express, the original will always have a special place for you, because you can imitate something, you can never duplicate it, and the originals were just that, the originals. But Barry, in terms of, like you say, working ability, what you could do the most with, what in terms of the quality of the match. I mean, Barry had it all. He had the size, he had the looks, the women flocked around him. Just a great worker, could do anything. Had the size. So that grouping of the Horsemen, in terms of that, if you owned the territory and wanted the grouping, that was it.
And 85, 86, 87, 88, the Horsemen are still going strong, but in 88, that's where the cash flow problem started with Crockett Promotions. And Dave Johnson, the good old accountant who was in over his head, and Jimmy Crockett really didn't know until it was too late that he'd been promised all this television revenue and all the pay-per-view revenue, and of course there was the battles with Vince. You were in the office at that time and saw that. How frustrating was it to see that it was a great regional promotion? The Carolinas was so strong, could have stayed strong for 20 years. There was no way that the WWF was going to take over the Carolinas. But at the same time, Jimmy was trying to chase Vince, who was seated in the major media empire of New York City, and in doing so, didn't change his office staff in terms of the bookkeepers and the accountants and the syndicators, etc.
He didn't have the infrastructure.
He didn't have the infrastructure. How frustrating was it to have the better product? Because nobody disputed that the NWA product at that time was better in the ring, but not be able to do the business outside of the core territory because of the lack of support.
I think to answer that question, even in my role, like I say, I had a dual role. I was working in the office all day, and I would run home, grab my clothes, run to the airport, and get on a flight with everybody else. And we were working 7 days a week, double shots on the weekends. So, as I look back, I don't know. It all happened so quickly. As I think back, I guess Jimmy didn't have a plan. He had people who had been with him a long time, that there's loyalties that go both ways, and some of those people that worked in the office had just always been there, and Jimmy wasn't about to replace them, and never, like Dave Johnson, the accountant, he probably never thought of beyond that, reaching a growth level where it was beyond his capabilities. I don't think that dawned on Jimmy until it was much too late. But I think when Watts sold his operation to Crockett, I think that was the turning point where Jimmy spread himself too thin. And I think there was friction in the family. I think David always wanted to be more involved than he was. Jimmy was the older brother, and he was the one that was given the responsibility, and Francis was Francis. And
the merchandising maven, Francis Crockett.
But Jimmy, for the first time, saw moving himself out of Charlotte. Watts had this beautiful office complex in Dallas. Dusty was talking about making movies and
Major motion pictures and sitcoms.
Why can't we do that?
And so, the boys would joke that Jimmy just moved to Dallas just to get away from the rest of the family.
And so the truth probably lies somewhere in between. But Jimmy told me, he said, a year from now, we will keep this, but we will be based out of Dallas, and I want you there too. So I bought a home a year in advance in Dallas in contemplation of going there. And of course, that's right when things started to fall apart. And I don't know what the deal was with Bill, but Jimmy, I think, spread himself too thin. And
he bought Kansas City. He bought the remnants of Kansas City, the remnants of Florida, and the UWF. Watts was still fairly strong, but a victim of the oil boom in his core territory, the oil bust.
I always wanted to be a promoter, and so when he bought what was left of Florida, Buddy Colt owned 5% that he sold to me for $3,000, and of course that, I think today what I could have done with that $3,000, but at that point I believe
could have bought lottery tickets.
I believe that Florida could be Florida again, and for me to have 5% ownership, because back in the glory days, Briscoe had a piece of it, and Dusty and Buddy Colt, Matsuda.
There were 10 guys that could make money out of having 5 or 10.
So I thought having this, and that I could get in then while it was for sale for not a whole lot of money, and of course I never got a dime out of it, and of course the stock became worthless. But
and then with the Dallas situation, basically, as we said, the Carolinas was so strong, and Carolinas, North and South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia. Crockett Promotions would have stayed in business forever had they been content with that, but they're trying to chase Vince, and they're spreading themselves too thin, and the UWF purchase was probably the last straw.
And another point, and you could probably maybe be a better judge of this because you're a great historian in the business, but I've heard comments made that Jimmy did not utilize the talent that Watts had.
Not at all.
When he brought him in, that there was a failure there of not utilizing that talent that we could have. Our depth could have been much.
Two schools of thought in that you couldn't have the other brand come in and be stronger than the guys that you were committed to, the horse that you rode in on, the one that brung you to the dance, whatever the case may be.
Which is why when Vince bought WCW and they were going to try to.
They made the same mistake, but wasted a lot of $1 million instead of a few million.
But it's the same logic. I think you're absolutely right.
But by the same token, it's a manipulated business, and you have to create the challenges and create the threats before they can be real challenges and threats, and before they can draw money. So it was botched.
But Watts had some great talent that never really were utilized as they should have been.
And Dr. Death and the Freebirds at the time, and etc. But at that point, as we get into the fall of '88, there's no turning back. The cash flow's not there. He's committed, even though we're still drawing money. I mean, Richmond, Virginia, to $140,000, and the Great American Bash Tour in '88 was successful. He's got to sell. He's $2 million in the hole, and it ain't coming back, and the notes are coming due, and he's got
the story I heard is that Dave Johnson walked in one day to Jimmy and said, "I need $1 million," and Jimmy said, "No problem," and made the phone call, and whether it was a loan or however he did it, but then a week later, Dave Johnson walked in and said, "I need $1 million, another $1 million," and Jim, whoa, wait a minute, and that was like It happened just that fast.
Sandy Scott, his office right across the hall from Jimmy's, told me he walked in one day and he walked out about 30 seconds later and Dave's face was white and Jimmy's face was whiter, and all of a sudden, boom, that's when the talks began to sell to TBS. When did you first hear about the proposed sale to Turner Broadcasting, and we all had high hopes at the time. What did you think was going to come of it at that point?
Well, like I said, I was in the office every day and we were all running very hard and weren't aware of the problems going on behind the scenes, but the first red flag for me was, we used to get a check, we were paid weekly, and you had some idea how the town did, and a pretty reasonable anticipation of what your check was going to be, and all of a sudden you look at the check and then you find you're looking, well, one of the towns wasn't on there, and that never happened. That the story about, well, the money was late coming back from the town, I'm sure that had happened before, and it was more of an accounting thing, that they knew what the house was, knew what the payoffs were going to be, and so they paid the town off whether the money had come back or not. Now they didn't, so that was the first indication, and then that happened again. Then the rumors started going that they were talking to TBS, and I guess Jimmy first made it big when Vince envisioned doing WrestleMania, and he needed money to fund that major promotion. So he sold Jimmy the rights to provide the programming for TBS, which enabled Jimmy to have the national stage to tour nationally. Vince took the $1 million, which is the number that I've heard thrown around, and used that to bankroll the first WrestleMania, and both of them were off and running. So it was good. It was good for both. But prior to that, when Vince was doing the programming for TBS, Vince and Ted Turner butted heads. Ted always wanted to be a partner, supposedly, in everything that he, touched, and so he wanted an interest in that. And I guess Vincent told him that he didn't need him, and Ted resented that. So I think that created a foundation where now Ted was receptive to looking at Crockett Promotions. First, because he wanted to get into the wrestling business and to say to Vince, well, now I'm in the wrestling business too. And secondly was to protect the programming that was still doing good ratings on that time slot that after the program went off the air, been on for 25 years. But, we started here and then I think they brought everybody in and talked to everybody individually because they didn't know a lot about it, wanted to know what everybody did and looked at everything with a fine-tooth comb. And the message that I kept hearing was, well, we're not going to touch the wrestling product. All we're doing is giving you better financial resources. We're giving the advantage of our network connections globally, where we can now take your programming and give you the expertise of all of our equipment and everything, and then take the product and package it with other things and go places that you've never been before. And like you say, I think we were all excited to think, wow, yeah, that's right. We now have the deep pockets of Turner.
Because the product, like we said, was the month before the sale became final. Richmond, Virginia, with Flair against Luger, and Midnight Express against Tully and Arn did $140,000. The Bash had 42 dates that year in 45 days, from Seattle to Miami to wherever.
So we're the business
the product, the matches were good, the talent was good, the product was good, and we were still drawing money. And the boys felt let down that the business end had not held up their hard work.
Yes.
And so now we've got a billionaire that's going to back us and that owns network televisions, and it's going to be fantastic. And they're not going to mess with the wrestling, like you said. They're just going to promote us.
I heard that statement more than once.
And
we you know what you're doing. We don't plan to touch that. And of course, the ink wasn't even dry on the contract. And
November 1st, 1988, the day the music died.
And every closet wrestling fan that worked at TBS that had any sphere of influence came out of the woodwork to try and, throw their 2 cents in as to, to how they were going to make it better. And I hate to single out people, but Jeff Carr, who, when WCW closed down, was still there and had gone from, he was a senior vice president, he was well up there, but anyway, he was involved with programming then, and I remember him saying, this isn't that complicated, we put Flair against Sting on TV next week. Okay, Jeff, I nice idea, and I admit it's going to really help ratings. We will spike ratings. We will do a good rating with that. But in our business, it's not only about ratings. That is a means to promote all these other things, which is where our revenue stream comes from. And beyond that, we have to think about the week after, and the week after, and the week after, and some idea where we're going. Well, that whole premise was foreign to them. Because they were a broadcast company, I think they focused totally on ratings, and I think they came to think that as long as ratings were healthy, as long as ratings continued to grow, more eyeballs were watching, and all these other numbers would take care of themselves.
But if you give away the product,
yes,
the entire product for free, nobody's going to pay for the pay-per-views, or nobody's going to pay to see the live events.
It's a balancing
and it had
act.
to be,
You have to get that balance, and that's the challenge.
Explain from your perspective. I've tried to get everybody I can think of who was there. How the hell did Jim Herd end up with that job? Probably, if anybody's responsible for the downfall of WCW, Bischoff obviously has his share, Vince Russo has his share, everybody, but it started for so many of the formative years. It's like abusing a child for the first 5 or 6 years of its life and then expecting it to grow up normal and not sociopathic. Jim Herd was the one who started the road to ruin the very first day he was hired. How did he get that job with no qualifications whatsoever?
Well, I think in hindsight, I came to understand about how he got hired, because I think when they hired him, he's actually working for Pizza Hut.
Yep.
But prior to that, he had been in the television industry. He'd been the station manager in St. Louis during the period of time that Sam Muchnick enjoyed great success and did the televised wrestling from the Chase Hotel.
And he had directed.
And he had directed that. So if you're somebody in TBS, it's like, well, here's this animal that we don't know anything about, and how are we going to figure out how to run it and manage it? And the Crockett's all had a deal that I think they were kept on as consultants, but
5 years.
But I think they thought, well, here's where they took it. So obviously we don't want to trust their judgment. We need to look at somewhere for some fresh blood. And Jim Herd, in their eyes, was one of them. By them, I mean a television person, had some history in television, and the fact that he'd been a producer at the television station where they did the wrestling, it's like, oh, well, here's a TV guy that also knows wrestling.
And
He's our man.
The story that I also heard, the fact that his wife was best friends with the wife of
Luthez, I think.
but no, also somebody at TBS. Was it one of the Bobs? Bob
Dew or
Bob, whichever. Yeah,
somebody.
but yeah, his wife knew the boss's wife at blah blah blah. Did you ever get any feedback? And now you weren't long for the company at that point.
I left 6 weeks later.
But did you ever get any? Did they ever realize what a bad mistake they had made with Jim Herd? Obviously not. He was there for several years, and that pretty well doomed it. But
yeah, I wasn't there long enough.
They started trying to blame the wrestlers, which was a common theme we're going to get to in this portion of the thing. Always blame the boys. Blame the boys. You got to blame the boys. You, at that time, you saw Tully and Arn had left right before the sale. As a matter of fact, they dropped the World Tag Team title, the Midnight Express, their last night. They went to work for Vince in the WWF, which led to, by the way, the greatest wrestling match of your career.
Oh.
Main event, cage match in Philadelphia when Tully and Arn had left, and they had this big program invested in us. So you and I managed to carry you for 7 whole minutes.
Yes, you did.
And beat you without making myself look bad.
Yes.
No, I've never, we were talking about this last night, and I've never publicly said this, but I much as El Santo, I appreciate now, in hindsight.
You better be careful what you're saying, because somehow Vince McMahon may own the rights to that.
Okay, but no.
Somebody come knocking on your door and say, give me the tape.
Actually, I had a friend of mine stashed in the balcony. I didn't tell the office about it because I wanted to tape for posterity, so I got a copy on VHS at home, but much as in the El Santo business, I never appreciated until years later how kind you were in putting up with 7 minutes of my falderall and actually putting me over. But we did do $74,000 in Philadelphia for the two of us in a cage. That's not too bad.
And we had some fun too.
We had fun, and looking back on that, I know what you mean when you say, people in those days would pass on knowledge rather than just, oh God, how can I get out of this as quick as possible? And I appreciate what you did for me, but you then followed, Tully and Arn to put a word in, and you followed in early '89 to the WWF, and impressions briefly on Vince at that time. Pat Patterson, Jim Barnett was there, moving back to Connecticut, which is close to your home, Titan Tower, the whole experience at that point.
Well, as you said, was I had great hope for where the company was going to go with the new management, and we didn't know. Then the word came that they hired Jim Herd, and
George Scott replaced Dusty.
George Scott replaced Dusty, and George had his success, but we did the pay-per-view. The first pay-per-view under the new company was in Norfolk,
Starcade,
and 5 minutes before the matches started, there was 4 empty seats in the front row across from Hard Camera. And I remember 5 minutes before the show started, in came Jim Herd with his wife on his arm, wearing a fur coat, with Lou Thez and his wife, that's not a knock on Lou Thez. They, I guess, somehow formed a friendship back when they were in St. Louis, and they paraded down the ringside, sat in the front row, and I thought, oh man, you know how sometimes first impressions, you don't get good vibes, and
instead of taking the product that wasn't broken and promoting it to new heights because the machine that was promoting it was broken, it was sort of a public display of, now somebody's in charge.
Right, and we're going to break everything down, and we're going to fix this. And we all had, contracts were new to the business. I never had a contract till I worked for Jim Crockett. Everything was word of mouth, handshake thing, and my contract, they didn't have open-ended things in those days. And my first contract had run out, and Jim Barnett still worked, and he had helped broker the deal between Turner and the Crockett's. And so I remember Jim saying to me, well, he said, your contract's expired. He said, I need to get you together with Jim Herd, and he said, we need to get your contract worked out. And I, by design, wanted to avoid I wanted to see what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And in the middle of all this, as you said, Tully and Arn had gone to Connecticut, and I got a call out of the blue not too long after the sale, and Tully called and said, I'm up here, and he said, Vince and Pat Patterson do all of the booking. They've got TV every 3 weeks. They got 2 syndications, and they're running 3 towns a night, and they are worn thin, and they need help. And he said apparently he worked with Terry Garvin and Amarillo, which I did, and in Kansas City. And he said he spoke very highly of you, and he said they want to talk to you. And if so, I said, I don't know if you're happy there, what's going on, but they're interested in you if you want to make the phone call. And so I finally called Terry Garvin, and I always liked Terry. Terry was one of the characters in our business, but he had a good heart, was a good guy, and worked he was as good a promoter as I think I ever worked with in terms of running spot shows. But he said, he had put me over to Pat, and he said, he put Pat on the phone, and I'd met Pat one time in Kansas City. He came to visit Terry, only time I ever met him. And so I didn't know him at all, and he said, yeah. So I had a couple days off before Christmas, and was going to go to New York on a shopping trip with the one who became my last wife. And so while I was up there, Vince arranged to have a car sent to Manhattan to the Marriott there at Times Square, and pick me up and bring me to his house. And he did that a lot for situations where he wasn't sure, or the people weren't sure what they were going to do, and he didn't want to put them in a situation where they burned a bridge because the word was out he was talking to us.
Well, yeah, we did that in '86, and we ran it. What was Tully's friend's name at U.S. Air in Charlotte?
Oh, yeah.
But we were going on this big kayfabe trip to New York, and we run into him at the gate, and by the time we got back, everybody knew where we'd been. And, and Ernie Ladd had talked us into going to begin with. But all Vince would talk about at that time was, the dolls are going to look just like you, and it didn't compute with us, and we stayed where we were. But Vince would treat people who didn't work for him better than the people who did work for him. He'd get limousines and airplanes and dinners, and then it was McDonald's and a taxi cab when you actually took the job. But anyway, so you were up there.
Yeah, I went to the house, and I remember I got up to the house, and Vince wasn't there. And Pat was there, and he said, well, Vince is tied up at the studio. So he said, why don't we go into Greenwich and we'll go get a drink or something. So we went into some little hole-in-the-wall bar in Greenwich, and of course, Vince's house is
opulent.
Yes. And we were there, had a couple drinks, and then go back to the house, and then Vince still wasn't there, and he's on his way. Vince came in, still had his makeup on from the Dillon TV, and I remember we met in this formal living room, and Linda came in with him, and basically it was offered me a job, and he said, you can do one of two things. You can either use me as leverage to help your deal back there if you want to tell them that you're talking to me and I'm interested in it. And he said, I don't have a problem with that. He said, or I would like to have you. And he said, I would hope that you'll make your decision on the basis of the opportunity here. And basically I was told that I could name my price. So I had a pretty good year, and I figured, well, now I don't have the road expense because I'm going to be an employee. And so I kind of took off the road expenses because I told myself I don't want to make a step backwards, and if you don't want me as an on-air, which he made it clear he didn't. And so I gave him a number, and Vince said yes, and so I knew I was leaving. And then every time Barnett would call me sit down about a contract, and his office was in Dallas at that time where we were working, and so it was easy because I was on the road, just to never have it come up. And I left, my last match, I think, was the Battle Royal in Kansas City in mid-January. So it was only 6 weeks. No, it'll be a little more, 6 weeks, because I guess November 1, the sale took. So it was 10 weeks.
When you work for Vince McMahon as an office employee, especially in the creative department, it's like being a top brain surgeon or a NORAD specialist. You're on call 24 hours a day.
You're like a prisoner of war.
You have no, a prisoner of war. You have no personal life. You're expected to, if you leave his side, and this happened to me one time, you leave the studio where you've done raw live voiceovers at midnight, and he calls a meeting for 8 o'clock in the morning, and you don't answer the phone at 7:30 to hear about it, and come to the office at 9 o'clock like you're supposed to. You're the worst person in the world.
Yeah, you screwed up.
It had to be insane to go into that environment where you've left total incompetence, and near total incompetence at that time, and you go into the situation where you're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can't get away from it. He overanalyzes everything. It's almost like from total lackadaisical attitude to complete obsession.
Well, they hadn't bought Titan Tower, so it was. The original office was a small four-story building in downtown Stamford, and across the street was the art department and the separate travel agency, which Linda owned 50% of. They did all the travel, and I was accustomed all those years from working 7 days a week and double shots on Sundays, so that part of it was not as difficult, but still, I was making a transition now to being a non-talent, to being an office person, having to go in with a suit and tie on every day. And Vince, it was impressive to see that he had the infrastructure that was lacking in Crockett Promotions, that he had professionals that were all very good people with credentials in whatever their area of expertise was, whether it was marketing, whether it was media, whatever it was, and that we were accustomed, and I'm sure you went through this with Smoky Mountain, where we would wear 10 hats to do 10 different functions on a smaller scale. Vince would have 10 people whose full-time job was to do that 1/10 that we used to do on a much bigger scale.
And it seemed that even though you're doing 1/10, that it took the same amount of time, which was every bit of your time. Yeah. The work expanded to fill the time available.
But Vince was hands-on with everything. Every decision that was made. If there was a poster for a pay-per-view, Vince approved it. And I remember the attention to detail, and I can say I was always a detail person. So if this pay-per-view, I remember the one had a picture of Hulk, just fully blown in the ring, and then behind him was this sea of people And Vince pointed out that when they shot this picture, which is going to happen, somebody has to go to the bathroom sometimes, that there would be 3 or 4 empty seats, but they would create people in those seats so that every seat was filled. And where Hulk's hair didn't, always look the best, they would touch that up. So these were the attention to detail that I was not accustomed to, that I think were part of the reason why he was so successful. But it also, there was a burnout factor that and Vince never took any vacations, never took any time off. In fact, he
has a $15 million house in Florida. He spends 2 weeks a year there, and he works.
And it's like he resented people who did take vacations, and he never understood the logic that because you take a vacation doesn't mean that you love the business any less or you're any less dedicated. And you can relate this too from Smoky Mountain and other experiences. When you do something, there are times in your life where you get burnt out, you're tired, and you need to recharge. And my thinking is that you would come back after a 2-week hiatus. Sometimes you see things more clearly than you did before because you just push it so hard and get
you might be
tired.
more valuable because
you're
you have
you're a greater asset.
Refreshment.
Yes, you've got you're recharged. You look at things differently. But Vince didn't see it that way. I mean, he called people back from vacation to fire him. Called Bruce Pritchard back one of the times he fired him for vacation to fire him, and I think he did the same thing to Jim Ross. And what was so difficult was because Vince was hands-on with everything, the time in the office was busy doing all of the everything that was involved with the magazine, posters, the jacket to this album that was coming out, and they were involved with Saturday Night Main Event. There were so many projects. They did the movie project, and he was all totally involved in that. All of the creative was mostly done on the weekends. So I was in the office all week, and then on the weekend you would go out to the house, and typically it would be 8 o'clock Saturday morning. You drive to Greenwich, which was probably 20 to 30 minute drive, 25 minutes to his house. In the summertime, we would work outdoors. He had like a
poolside
area, poolside, and he had
big grill in the roof.
The phone jacks out there, so that he just came out and plugged in phones, and he had a bank of phones. And in the wintertime, you would go in his formal dining room and work on the dining room table. And you would work. We typically would work in the morning. At lunch, there was a place called Little Red Store that was a couple miles away, and you get down there. And
great chicken fingers.
Yeah, they made deli sandwiches and things, and you would get back and work while you ate. And then, of course, late in the day, if Linda was home, she would cook, or they had in those days.
By the time that I got there, that was ixnay. You didn't get dinner.
And but you would stay, and they would cook dinner, and Vince had not unique eating habits, but there were certain things that he liked, and that's what was cooked. And
food is fuel. Doesn't matter what it tastes like, as long as it's low fat and easy to consume, and whoop down, and
So whether it was a housekeeper or Linda, they made, and I don't remember Shane and Stephanie having dinner that many times.
It explained the dichotomy to me of Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. Vince Sr., everybody knows that Vince Sr. made Vince Jr. promise that certain people would have jobs for life or close to it, Jay Strongbow's or Tony Gurria's of the world. But at the same time, while that loyalty is applied to the people that his father promised jobs to, everybody that he's hired, he's fired 16 times.
Yeah.
He'll fire him and bring him back, fire him and bring him back. And I've never understood.
Like George Steinbrenner and Billy Martin.
And
bring him back.
And I'm not really. I mean, they drove me nuts and took over my company in Louisville, so I'm not real happy with them. But I've never understood. He has to keep people off balance on their toes all the time. Looking back on it, and as well, the people that it seems like are the most loyal to him and trying to look out for the interests of the company are the ones that he'll give the Iggy to, as we'll get to here in a few minutes when we talk about your departure. But the people who are confrontational with him, or who have sued him, or who have walked out on him, or whatever, he will try to get, or in Bischoff's case, try to put him out of business. He will try to bring them in at any cost just to prove that he can. I I don't understand it.
And I think that I saw many times where I always thought that he got some perverse pleasure out of taking someone, elevating them to heights that they never dreamed that they could get to, and then when they least expect it, knock the pins out from under him and watch them topple down, that he somehow got some perverse pleasure from that. And it happened too many times to not start to think that's how he was. But the hard part was, and I am a huge fan of Pat Patterson, that I came to respect Pat's knowledge of the business of how to put matches together. And what Pat became a master at was learning how to communicate with Vince. A lot of people had a big problem because Vince is he's very charming, very smooth, but he's also can be a very intimidating figure. And he would say, I don't want to surround myself with yes people. I want people to give me honest input and tell me the truth. And in most cases, that's exactly what he didn't get. Because he had people,
every time somebody did that, he'd fire them.
Yeah, he made it difficult for people to disagree with him.
Pat was such a diplomat. He could disagree with Vince, but make Vince think that he was agreeing with him in terms of they both together had to do something about the problem. But if you just disagreed...
and Pat knew where the line was. He knew how far to push it and when to back off. And he knew where to make it an issue and where to not say anything. And I remember when Jarrett came in. You know, Jerry came in with eyes wide open of giving a fresh perspective and ideas that they hadn't heard before. And Jerry would be involved in that process with Pat before it ever got to Vince, and Pat's fat answer was, well, no, Vince will never go for that. So that things never reached Vince's ear.
Now I know where Bruce learned it.
Because it was filtered by Pat. And that got to be very frustrating for somebody like Jerry. But Pat knew what Vince liked and developed a knack of giving it to Vince by the shovelful.
When I went there, Bruce served the same purpose, and that I would say this and that, the other thing, or how about this, or whatever it was. Bruce would filter out 70% of it with, oh, Vince won't like that. Well, why don't we ask him? Oh, you get heat. Well, so as a result, I don't know whether it was they didn't want other people's ideas to supersede their own. I don't know whether, and I'm sure Vince wouldn't have liked most of those ideas because he does what he likes to do, but he never had a chance to pitch them.
No.
And so it was frustrating to. Well, why did you hire me then? The ceremonial turning in of the papers. Here's television. Thank you, my son. You know, so that it was a frustrating thing where you're hired because of your individuality and your creativity, but then you never get the opportunity to show it because now you have to apply yourself to learning how to write what they want you to write, which they could have done to begin with, and you didn't have to be there.
And there was another frustration level too, that like when we would go on weekends, especially right before the TV. You would meet the weekend before to begin to write TV in advance, but because there was that another weekend that you could fall back on, you would end up making generic discussions about everything imaginable and never put the first name down.
Nothing on paper.
Now you're to the last week and TV is Monday, Tuesday, so you have to do it. And Vince used to work backwards. If it was June, he would be thinking WrestleMania next March, April. And this is a dream match that I can see there. Now to get there, I got to work backwards with what I do, and then you didn't have the monthly pay-per-views then, so you had the Royal Rumble with a feature match, you had Survivor Series, you had SummerSlam, and you would spend a whole week in brainstorming about this would fit nicely in here because whether it would throw a curve or eventually getting to where you want it. That was good, except the nature of the wrestling business is that all you have to do is have one piece of the equation either piss Vince off and get fired, do something crazy, get hurt, all the multitude of things that could happen in our business. And all of that planning now.
And when you brought the monthly pay-per-views in and then the weekly live televisions, but he was still trying to do it the same way, then it was insane because nothing would stay the same for 3 weeks. And then it went the other side, the pendulum switched the other side in that stuff was being done with a week's notice. And then it never fit a month down the road to begin with.
And you would be out there on a weekend to do the TV. The phone would ring. It was Hulk, and a lot of the times he would talk to Hulk, but some things were of a nature that he wanted to talk to Hulk privately. He would get up and go in the house, where sometimes he'd go in the house for a power nap, 15 to 30 minutes. And Pat and I would sit there.
You can't do anything.
We could kick ideas around, but Vince had to give his blessing, and then Pat and I could fill in once we got, like with the bookings. If we got past the top 2 or 3 matches and it had the look that Vince wanted, then we could fill it out logistically of who was going where, things were crisscrossed.
What was, Vince would call it mental masturbation, when you sit and discuss something that you have absolutely no control or power over to change or manipulate, and that's what, when I used to try to write TV with Bruce, and we would go to his house, because Bruce knew, although he wouldn't tell me, that we were going to do absolutely nothing, because you couldn't do anything unless Vince was right there in front of you.
Yep.
But we were allegedly working, and we were by his phone, so if the office called, we were supposed to be working, but meanwhile we're playing with his dog and we're going to lunch for 3 hours. And my first week I was like, are we going to write this television so we can go home? Or I can go home? And he said, well, we got to be working. I said, we're not working, we're playing with your dog. Yeah, but if they call, we're working.
And that was the other thing.
I'm going crazy.
We would start like a Saturday at 8 o'clock. We would work through the lunch, which was okay. We'd end up staying there to dinner, and we would be there at night to the point that you're like this.
Yeah.
Now you got a 30-minute drive home. Sometimes you would break a little bit earlier, and then Vince and Linda would make plans to go into the city to have dinner or something. Pat would run home and get a shower to come back to join them to go have dinner. Now, the last person that I wanted to see at the end of the day, and there was nothing personal, was I want to be home with my family.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be with Vince and Linda and, the part of being with his entourage, that, with whatever perception that is that you're in the inner circle, we're as thin real quick. And then, now it's, okay, you don't get it all done, so you got to come back Sunday. But it was never in cement. I shouldn't say never. Seldom in cement, be back here 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
Well, I'll call you guys in the morning because they were going out to dinner, didn't know how late they'd be back. Now, it's the same thing. You're sitting there in the morning, looking at the clock, 8 o'clock, and he says, come on now, I got to be up and get showered. So you would sit and wait for the phone to ring. Finally, at 10 o'clock, I'm like, Pat, did you hear anything from Vince? No, I think I'll give him a call. Now, Pat would then call Vince. Vince would say, well, what are you doing, Pat? Well, I'm not doing anything. Well, if you're not doing anything, why don't you come over? Pat would call me and say, well, I'm heading over. Well, I'll get there as soon as I can. Then there were the rare times.
That was what Pat lived for.
There were the rare times when, for whatever the reason, Pat would go over and not call me, and I would sit all day, and then I would find out Monday that Pat was over there. They didn't call me. I sat at home. It wasn't like I had a day to go somewhere with my family, because I'm sitting there waiting for the phone to ring while Pat's over at Vince, but they never called me. Now, what does that mean? This business has a tendency to make you paranoid.
Hello, I wonder what he means by that.
It's in my opinion, all of a sudden, not have any value, and on the other hand, I'm sitting at home to wait, and it's like, well, honey, I need a quart of milk. I'll run to the store. Murphy's Law, run to the store, you come back. Vince called. Called Vince. Where were you, Pally? Vince, I ran to the store to get a quart of milk. Well, we're very,
traveling with Vince. Also, here, we're going to get off this in a minute, but we're venting. We're letting all this frustration out. He's a maniac. We were on a plane, Delta, whatever, to New York from a TV. Thunderstorms, New York, planes diverted to Albany. Well, first Vince stands up and starts knocking on the pilot's door, and this was pre-September 11th, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway. He demanded to have a conference with the pilot to find out why they couldn't go to Philadelphia, which is closer, instead of Albany, or why they might not could go to JFK instead of LaGuardia, or whatever. Once Vince was satisfied, and by the way, agents were there to meet the plane, and he told them the same thing he told the pilot: I don't like the way your airline treated me and diverted me without consulting me first. But anyway, once he was satisfied, okay, we're going to Albany. Then we get there, we rent a car, it's thunderstorms, it's pouring down rain. Me, Jim Ross, Bruce Pritchard, Vince has to drive
100 miles an hour.
100 miles an hour down the interstate from Albany. I'm in the back seat. You could have stuck a lump of coal up my ass and come out with a 10-carat diamond. I'm clutching seat cushions like, please just let me get out of here alive. I can't take this anymore. I've seen him burn rubber in cops' faces that stopped him and give him a ticket. And he'd say, is that all now? And the cop would say, yes, sir, you're free to go. And he'd grab the ticket, throw it on the dashboard, hit the gas, and blow gravel in the cop's face. I couldn't wait to get out of the car. I couldn't wait to get, and finally, thank God I was able to go on the road as a talent on the weekend, so I was already out there and I didn't have to travel with them, because you had to talk about stuff all the way there and all the way back, plus be at the building 12 hours, plus endure this constant, attempted murder.
Taking it a step further, I started like February of '89 and got married November of '89. I had children late in my life. I had twins when I was 50, and the boy of the twins was born with cerebral palsy. So my outlook on life, that was a huge point in my life where I looked at everything differently. And Shane then started coming into the business. Now you not only had Vince with his wild ways, you now had someone who Vince was, his father was his role model, who was trying to compete with him.
Yeah.
So now you had the competition factor between the two of them, and I finally said to myself, I don't want to be in the car with either one of these idiots when they finally wrap it around the tree and I can't be home to provide for my family. I stopped riding with them. I started riding with Howard Finkel. Howard would rent the car. He would get the reservations at the Super 8, which was okay with me, because I had the peace and quiet of not being, and I was well past the being part of Vince's entourage and his inner circle and whatever perceptions were.
Yeah, here comes the office.
Yes, and I was well beyond that. And finally, I don't know what it was. We got called in one day, and Vince, you don't like Vince anymore? He would always then, in those conversations, refer to Vince in the third person. It was never, you don't like me anymore. Oh, you don't like Vince anymore? I said, no, Vince.
The royal we.
I said, do you want me to tell you the truth? Oh, by all means. Well, I always think that I was a little bit different because I told him the truth, what I wanted. I said, Vince, my twins were born. I recognize that tremendous responsibility on many levels, and if something happens to me, there is nobody to take care of them. And to be honest with you, to being in a car with you, driving 100 miles an hour with no cares or responsibility or thought about what's going to happen, and then you trying to, I told him right between the eyes, and your son is trying to compete with you, and both of you trying to outdo each other. Guess what? I don't need to be in the back seat when the time comes, if the time comes. I'll ride with Howard Finkel. I can stand to be around Howard Finkel. And of course, Vince sits up in the chair, the chest is out, and so our relationship, whatever deterioration was as a result of things like that, but I think a lot of people who related to Vince and did tell him the truth were the few people who had some financial independence. Pat saved his money, had money. If Vince had fired him, which wasn't going to happen, you wouldn't have had to have a benefit for Pat. Jerry Briscoe, always, Jerry saved his money, and Jerry's fine. And Jerry learned from Pat how to talk to Vince.
As a matter of fact, part of what I want to get into the story of how you became my personal hero.
But I wasn't that bright because I was not independently wealthy. But I and I don't know. It's like it was a personal decision that because to go through life, to me, it's important to be able to get up in the morning and be able to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
Some people can do things and make decisions and do and I'll be the first to say I've made a lot of mistakes. I've done things that if if I had it to do all over again, maybe I would have done it a different way. But in all the years I was in the business, and this is a tough business. This is a tough business to survive in. I never deliberately hurt someone else. Someone may have had their feelings hurt or may have been angry with me because I was the messenger of something, but I never ever did anything to anyone. I couldn't play games and have fun at Howard Finkel's expense because I'm not a mean-spirited person. But did I see it? Absolutely. And it was a big ha ha ha. And Howard Finkel's not going to hurt anybody. I could never do that. But I can get up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror.
Well, the way that you left the company, and I want to get into this while we've still got some time left, because I didn't realize it until I read the book.
Yeah, Sophie, nobody knew the truth.
This happened in late '95. I didn't arrive and become part of the creative team until first part of '96, so I was not there. And when you left and gave notice in a very spectacular way, Bruce Pritchard, we were at his house playing with his dog, and he related it to me. He related the Office's story, and I didn't know at that time because I've known Bruce for so many years. I thought certainly we're alone in his house. He's going to tell me, who got screwed and why, rather than, I didn't know that he thought that Vince had probably bugged his house. He'd been fired once. I hope to God I never need a job that bad that I have to basically lie to my friends, which he did, and I love you, Bruce, but you lied to me about a number of things. He made you to be the heel, and I didn't know the backstory, so all that time I was, well, that's not like JJ, and I can't believe JJ did that. And for years I was thinking, I can't believe the way JJ treated them after what they did for him, which is the story I got from Bruce. Oh, we were treated like a king and blah, blah, blah. When I read your book and found out the story, and now that I knew it in hindsight that it wasn't concocted by you, I had verification with other people, you became my personal hero because it shows Vince has always, for whatever reason, been embarrassed to be in the wrestling business. And down deep, he thinks he's somehow greater. He fosters the opinion with Kevin Dunn, the folks in the studio, that they're an entertainment company, they're not wrestling. And so he treats his wrestling people differently than he does his regular employees or his executives because they can get jobs anywhere. But he feels like, well, the wrestling people can only get a job here or somewhere lesser than me, so I'll treat them anyway. So as a result, point being, you became my hero because you ended up with somewhat of the last word, and go into how that came about.
Like I say, when I went up there, Vince, like I say, can be very charming, and it was name your own price. And the numbers are in my book, so I don't. It's not like it's a huge secret because I talk openly about everything. But I had made, I want to say, like $210,000 a year before, and I had a very good year. It's probably my best year. So I told Vince, I said, I don't want to make a step backward. I will be an on-air talent if you want me to. If you don't, I respect that decision. I'll make that transition, and I think I can be valuable to you. So I looked at the road expense, and I think I want to say the number was $175,000, and Vince hired me on that as a salary with profit sharing, benefits, and everything else. But the other side of it was still 7 days a week. In the midst of all this, they went through the federal indictment where Vince was charged with transporting a controlled substance, and the grand jury, I was called into the grand jury too, but I had nothing to say because it happened before I was there. So they threatened you, and then I said, well, they dismissed me, go home. And there was the media circus of all of that. And Vince...
Business was bad.
Business was bad, and Vince... I know deep down inside that Vince thought that they were going to get him. That it's like if the federal government wants you bad enough, they're going to get you on something. And I think he, in his own mind, realized that there was a very good possibility he was going to be found guilty in due time. I'm not getting into the guilt innocence thing. I'm just what he perceived.
If he felt, regardless whether he was indeed guilty or innocent, if they want you, they're going to get you.
Right, and that was
which is something that's probably feasible.
The whole thing where Jarrett was brought in, which was my suggestion, and it started out with I stayed in touch with Jarrett over the years from that experience of working in Memphis. I always liked Jerry, and I don't know how the conversation came, but I got Jerry and Vince hooked up on one of those phone conversations. It started as a 1 hour, became a 3 hour thing each week, and I just Vince used to make a joke out of it. He used to tell, that Pat and I would have to bring our paper and pencils and go up to the visiting room on the phone, and we'd have to do our booking sessions there. And so I told him, I said, Jerry Jarrett has done everything that you've done, mirrored what you've done on a much, much smaller scale. He's television production. He's been a leader with vignettes, music. He's done different style of matches there that were new to the business. He's been a survivor in the business because he knows how to run his business and to make the adjustments.
And basically, Jarrett was being brought up to be acclimated to how the WWF worked, so that in the eventuality that Vince was incommunicado, that Jerry Jarrett could keep the company running in that respect. And then...
So the next step was Vince had me bring Jerry up there. He said, well, get Jerry and bring him up here, get a place for him to stay. And his son was in senior in high school, playing football and on the Stars, and so Jerry would fly home early Friday to go see his boy play football. And it was Jason, was his son, the younger son. Vince, then the trial ended. Vince was found not guilty, and there was no more need for Jerry to be there. So Jerry stayed for a while, and then finally it's like, Vince, why am I here? And so he sent Jerry home, and Jerry got paid probably for another year, which was a good deal for Jerry. But Jerry was there and had a positive
Still think Vince
influence.
pays people that don't need money a lot better than he pays people that need money.
That's true.
But anyway.
But as a result of that verdict, the legal fees were, and business was down, as you said, plus the legal fees, that he was not public at that point. He owned the company, and they were in excess of $5 million. So Vince called a meeting one day. They were in Titan Tower now, and I remember him saying to everybody that was there.
And it was the wrestling people.
No, this was the whole company.
The whole company, okay.
The whole company's in there, and he said, it's behind us now. He said, before I was, whether it was knowingly or not, was distracted, did not put the amount of time and mental concentration on the product because I had this diversion that I had to deal with. That's past. Now I'm back focusing all of my attention, but we've got to get through this hurdle because the company has lost money for the first time, but I know that of the $6 million we lost, $5 million was in the one-time legal fees, and we can get this turned around. And of course, the next day, the water coolers, the coffee service on each floor, all of that was gone. They used to have a guard in the lobby and a guard at the back gate where you came, even though you had a swipe card to let the thing come in.
Oh, it's like getting into Fort Knox.
Now he's gone. You don't need him there because your card, And so all of the people were gone. And then they looked to cut further, and what they did was, and this is where I had a huge problem with Vince. Let me back up before that. I stayed there and rented a house for the first, I was there 7.5 years. I rented for the first 4 years. And, not knowing what the future held, my family came along. I had twins. I had another baby 2 years after that. So I've got 3 kids. The people who I rented from wanted to sell the house, and it wasn't the house that I wanted to buy. And just in conversation with Vince, and I'd been through a lot. I'd been through a divorce to get that mess cleaned up in order to remarry, and I had some income tax problems. But anyway, Vince said, well, why don't you, I told him I saw a house to rent. He said, well, why don't you buy a house? I have my credits all messed up, and
but some of the houses in that part of Connecticut are astronomical. I mean,
everything is
a
zoned.
2-bedroom starter house with $300,000 or $400,000.
Yeah, out where I was, in the nice school districts were zoned, for 1 or 2 acres, and you would have houses that somewhere else would be a fraction of what they cost there. Like I said, real estate values were just out of whack. But anyway, so this is your home. This is your last stop. You need to get your roots here, and so he basically encouraged me to look into a house. That was where I was going to stay. So anyway, found a house, and in order to, first of all, he said, call Doug Sageson, and he said, I want him to have this house. This is it. His roots are here. He's here. This is the last stop. And he said, I want you to use our bank and our influence to do whatever we need to do to get him qualified. He's had some problems went through a divorce and taxes. Web says yes. So I applied for the loan, and the loan gets denied. And so I said, Vince, the loan got denied. So he calls Doug, we know what's going on. Doug, well, disregard that, I'm looking into this. Well, long story short, I had one loan, which was an interest-bearing loan with Titan that helped me get out of the income tax aspect and the divorce settlement from before, that I was paying interest and it was coming out of my paycheck each week. Now to get into this house, I had to meet the ratios, had to pay off some credit card debt, some other things, and needed a higher percentage down payment to get in. So whatever I had in profit sharing, I paid the penalty to take that out, and the note ended up going from, I want to say, let's say $80,000 to like $160,000. Now I owe Vince $160,000 to get into this house that he insists that I have. And I want to temper it. I want to be honest. I bought the house. I signed the mortgage, not him. But there's a comfort level with someone that, and it's not like you've been there 6 months and he says, I want you, you're part of my team. You're going to stay here. I've been there 4 years or longer, and he's saying, okay, I'm happy with the job you're doing for me, and I want you to stay here, and I want you to get a house. You need roots here. So I buy this house.
Slowly but surely, you're being handcuffed to this level of income in this particular location and incurring debts that you have to pay.
Right.
To
So
do
now
this.
I've undertaken this mortgage obligation, and the note that I owe Titan, which bears interest based on the income that I'm making. Following this meeting, Vince calls all of the quote-unquote wrestling people following the other meeting. And the problem that I had, if Vince had said to everybody in that general meeting, everybody's going to have to take a 5% pay cut until we get back on our feet, and then we'll try to make it up to you. He didn't do that. He took me, he took Ross, he took Howard Finkel, he took Al Hayes, Pat Patterson even. I take Pat at his word, Bruce, and it was all of the quote-unquote just a small nucleus of wrestling people, and depending on who you were, our salaries were cut from 25 to 40%. I was at the higher end, so for me it was 40%. By that time, I was making $200,000, and my paycheck went from a Friday $200,000 to Monday to $120,000. Now, I'm in that house that he strongly recommended that I needed to have and helped me get in it based on everything that was done. So now...
And I know, because from being in Connecticut, being there 3 years and renting a house an hour away from the office with traffic for $2,200 a month, which I could have bought. I paid as much in rent in 3 years in that house as I bought my house in Tennessee for in cash. So,
I make the statement in my book, and I feel this way. I'm a survivor. If I had to live in a phone booth to survive by myself, I would somehow make that work. I'm a strong person and can do it. But when you threaten to take the food off the table with my family, when I've got twins that are a little over 2 years old, one of which with special needs, and a baby that's 6 months old and diapered, and you threaten me losing everything, I look at things differently, and I look at him differently, and that's how I look. And I put my house on the market, a house which I had not intended to buy and then turn around and sell. It took me a year and a half to sell the house. I took a $50,000 loss in the property to sell it. Along the way, because of the difference in the salary, risked losing it all, and there was a couple of, I like to call miracles, one of which a hot water heater ruptured in the basement and put water this deep that ruined everything in the basement, and I took the insurance settlement to get caught up on to meet 2 mortgage payments, and somehow I was able to
get
to the point that I could sell. It's hard for somebody else to relate to something like these, say, we have to walk a mile in somebody's shoes. You have to be able to understand what I was going through emotionally. And now I'm having to keep my game face at work every day. I'm thinking if anybody finds out that I'm having my house up
and you're
for
at this
sale,
point, you're the vice president of talent relations. You're in charge of contracts. You're in charge of all travel, everything to do with
I was
talent
doing
relations,
payoffs.
getting payoffs, getting talent paid, getting them to the events, getting the contracts done. It's an integral part of the part that Jim Ross did for so long, so well, and that John Laurinaitis has since bungled so completely. It's a very important. It's one of the most important jobs in the company.
Yeah. And you have to. You couldn't do it if you didn't have the wrestling background, because you have to understand the people that you're dealing with and having.
But at the same time, he calls one of the most important executives he has in, who he is given that job to, and cuts your money, and you have to bite your tongue for over a year because you can't give notice when you still have a house that it's everything you can do to stay in Connecticut, and you can't take a job anywhere else without being away from your family, so you're trapped.
The end of the road was after a year and then a 6-month extension on a real estate agreement. It ran out, and my wife stumbled on something who was the person who bought the house. As you know, when you buy property, they give you a closing date. And the closing date was circled on the calendar. And the closing date happened to be Friday the 13th, and Shane McMahon was getting married the next day. And
that was part of the plot. You wanted to go to the newspapers and ruin Shane's wedding, according to Bruce.
And so, after all that I had been through, I could not work the day that and the house was to have settled on Thursday. And as it turned out, sometimes this happens, you got bumped back a day. It didn't actually settle until actually Friday. I went into the office and gave him my resignation letter while my wife was, with the power of attorney, was getting closure of the house done. I had been living, the furniture had already been cleared out, was in a moving van headed, which again, that's a whole other story. Didn't have another job. That was part of the story, that I had made a deal with WCW, which was incorrect. Didn't have a job. I only went to Atlanta because I thought the chances were best that I might get hired there.
Well, when there's only one other place to work in the business, that's pretty well where you might head.
And with the closure, after paying everything, taking the losses, my wife had $20,000 in cash in her purse, 2 dogs in the kennel. We packed in a rental car and drove to Boston to go watch the Red Sox and clear the air for but I went in on Friday, the day before the wedding, and I waited till Vince was in the hallway, and I said, "Vince, can I see you for a minute?" Went into his office, and I said, I sat in your living room face to face with you the day you hired me, and so the day that it's over, I owe it to you to say it man to man to your face, and here's my letter of resignation. If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. And if you do want to talk about it, I'd be happy to, by all means. And of course, that became a 2-hour intense conversation between him and I, and only he and I know what was talked about in that room. But I already knew I was gone. I had cleared out my office except for 2 or 3 things that I could carry. And when I walked out, I don't think it hit him what I had done. I walked down to my office, I picked up those last few things, and I said to Priscilla, and I said, "I'm out of here, that's it." And I think Priscilla even helped carry a couple things. Went down, she came back up, and I took the elevator down to the 2nd floor to Human Resources, went and said, "Here's a copy of my letter of resignation. I gave the original to Vince. Here's my key to my office, and here's my key card to access," and walked out. As I was leaving, Vince came out of his office, and as I had my arms thing, he said, "Hey, Pally, can I help you?" I said, "No, Vince, I got it." It still, I don't think, dawned on him, and after I went through and down in the elevator, he walked down to my office, and they said, "He's picked up his things and he's gone." Gone? Gone where? I think he went down to Human Resources. Vince, from what I've heard, ran down the stairwell trying to catch me, got to the Human Resources. Now, I've already been there and gone, got in my car, and I'm gone. And of course, then the stories took on a life of their own from there.
From there.
And of course, I never went public in talking about the reasons why I left. Part of which I can't talk about because of the position that he put me in and threatened me with legal action. So I can't talk about my role as the director of the steroid program. But, you know, you can draw your own conclusions.
We're almost out of time, and we've still got. From there, you had another adventure in WCW.
Oh,
you got it, and this is going to be volume 2, folks, because we got to talk about Vince Russo and his part in the destruction of the wrestling business, and the Ed Ferraras, the Eric Bischoffs, the excesses, the talent out of control. Some more stories that we could fill in about the WWF. But for now, since we are almost out of time, one more time. If one chooses to purchase this fine publication...
Go to jjdillon.com. I have a personal website that when I got out of the business, I contemplated going into real estate, and that's how it started. But it's some great old pictures throughout my career, and right at the top, if you go to jjdillon.com, Wrestlers Are Like Seagulls is at the top, and you can see where to order the book. And
there's great pictures,
yeah,
including a classic shot of you in the weasel suit.
Yeah.
And there's Bobby Shane.
Yeah.
It's a great book. It's a great title. You got to get the book to find out why the title is so classic. And JJ, I appreciate you taking the time.
I want to thank you for this opportunity. It's like I lost track. We're sitting in front of cameras, and to me it was just a chat that you and I have never had a chance to talk in this depth. And I hate that we ran out of time, but I like the idea that maybe we can sit down and do it again and continue this conversation.
Volume 2, because I can spend an hour and a half on Russo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the Straight Shooting Series, for Ring of Honor, Jim Cornette, JJ Dillon, thank you. Check out Volume 2, soon to come, to a theater near you.